Great. Before we begin, actually, if we could, I'm going to just light a candle. I always like to just set the intention that whatever comes be for the highest good.
I
Of
have mine going already.
Great. And because I'm new to meet you, Julie and Owen, um, I'd love to just hear real quickly, one thing from each of you about, what you would like. Is there anything in particular you'd like me to bring as an intention for this program?
I am new to your work and have only really in the last several weeks, excuse me, been introduced to it, thanks to Justin orienting me to it. Um, and I'm particularly touched, I think, by the ways in which you weave together expertise in so many different disciplines, but with this like real contemplative quality to it and this curiosity and appreciation for the divine feminine, uh, which, in my own life as an American and as a male, is not something I have a great deal of familiarity with. Um, and so I have absolutely no doubt that that will be very present in your work today. But I want to say that that's I think what I'm looking for. I'm looking to touch that in a deep
Mm,
way,
mm,
in myself and in
mm,
a larger sort of cosmic sense.
mm, mm. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
That just made me feel so much closer to you. I love that. Thank you. Thank you.
And for me, I would say it's also the divine feminine.
Mhm,
Um, I was introduced to feminist theology back in the early 90s,
mhm.
before a lot of mainstream people were.
Yeah.
And I went through a phase of going to church and substituting she for he in every single piece of liturgy and hymn and getting really angry with the use of he all the time. Um, I am familiar with some of your work through originally through there was an early Christian mystics book discussion led by Mike Petro.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and
I love Mike. Yeah.
he's actually my spiritual director. So
Oh, give him a big hello for me. I
so
miss that man.
I will. I met with him earlier this week, and he says hello. I was telling him about this conversation, and great. I think the divine feminine is a lot of what we need here today in the world to balance out
Yeah.
um, what's what's wrong with the patriarchy, while understanding that the divine feminine and the divine male are
Mhm.
both needed.
Yeah, that's
We
great.
need
That's where my presentation ends with
Oh, perfect,
apropos.
perfect. So we need to have both.
Absolutely.
And for me, it fits in personally because I'll just give you a brief one sentence introduction. For me, I'm a scientist, I'm
Mhm.
an artist, and I'm a mystic. And
Like
I,
Hildegard.
I love Hildegard. If I had to like pick a patron saint, it would be Hildegard.
Yep.
And for me, it's I live and breathe science. I
Mhm.
mean, in terms of my point of view, like what I grew
Yeah.
up in, but it's very unbalanced.
Yep.
But it's the spirituality that oozes through my pores.
Yeah.
And I've been able to balance out my thinking brain with my embodied divine feminine brain with the art. And
Yep.
so I have really leaned into art over the last few years.
Doorway. Yeah.
And um, Justin mentioned we might be talking about mandalas. I just finished a 2-year spiritual direction program with the Hayden Institute. And
Mhm.
we had to pick a practice, a 21-day practice. And I worked with mandalas. And I find that any kind of artistic or creative pursuit brings allows the spirit to move with me.
Yeah.
And through me. And that totally helps with the thinking brain because now they're more integrated together, focused, and the divine feminine's part of that.
Beautiful. Beautiful. You know, I had totally forgotten that we talked about putting the mandalas in there. So I'm just going to pull up a couple of images to put in my slideshow right here, because there is so much, so much that I'd love to share with you. And it for me, it all is part of this Magdalene path of reuniting with our roots and connecting with nature. And that's just a huge part of this. And then, so I'll put a few of those in there as a practice of prayer. And then I could always do a second episode about that because that's a huge focus of my work right now, but I'll just do a little teaser there. And then Justin, any last minute words before we launch in about things that you'd like, you know, the longings that you have in your heart for what this might do for people or for you?
Yeah, so I'm fascinated by Mary Magdalene. I've done some diving into her after our conversation a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
I first sort of encountered her through the cloud of unknowing, where she's lifted up as the exemplar of the contemplative life, making a connection between her and Mary's sister Martha, which was common in the medieval period but isn't popular now. But I loved all of that idea, this idea of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus. And I love that Jesus says that she's chosen the better part and it won't be taken from her.
Yeah.
And to me, that speaks to the sort of eternal nature of the contemplative prayer, that it, once you've touched eternity, it's in eternity forever. There's no past and future there. So it's not like it can ever be taken away. So right. I think to have that contemplative prayer and that connection with Mary in that way always inspired me in wanting to be like Mary and having that as a model. So that's sort of the personal piece. And then in terms of what I'd like to see for everybody else, and also for me too, of course, is definitely how, as spiritual directors, we can learn from Mary. We can perhaps embody her presence to a certain degree. How we can, as spiritual directors, how we can touch that feminine stream of the Christian teaching and bring it in. Especially, for me as a man doing spiritual direction with people, I as Owen said, I just grew up in a patriarchal world as a tall white guy. So I'm sure I have some things that I could learn and grow in that regard as well. Okay. Yeah, that's sort of like the areas that pop into my mind right now.
Great. Okay. So I think I'll do my presentation and then I think I'd love to have that question that you just asked would be wonderful to engage in a conversation around. I just want to invite everybody to really get in your body. I had a wonderful Dominican spiritual director for 7 years who said, "What's so big about out-of-body experiences? My whole life has been an out-of-body experience." And I think that one of the things that Mary Magdalene and the archetype of Mary Magdalene and the feminine invites us to is to re-inhabit our bodies. So before I begin, I'm just going to invite everybody who's listening to put your feet on the ground, feel your dear feet on this earth, maybe even kick off your shoes. I'm barefoot, to feel your sense of your feet on Mother Earth. And then put your hands on your heart and then one on your belly too. And let's just take a couple of deep breaths together. I have got a lot of information for you, but I don't want it to feel like you're sucking on a fire hose. I want you to find the place inside of you that's more like a tuning fork that it will resonate with, or like a string on a harp. Mathilde of Magdeburg had this wonderful poetic phrase that every string that is plucked in love must sound. So I want to invite you to take a deep breath in and to start by turning your heart to the good. This is a phrase that we find in the Gospel of Mary, that Mary turned the disciples' hearts when they were in fear and trembling to the good. good with a capital G. And I want to invite you to go back in time and see what is the earliest memory that you can find of your own experience of something that you would call divine. Now, other people might not call it divine, but you would call it divine. A sunrise, a hug, the sound of music, seeing the ocean crash on a shore. Notice what comes to you when you think of the good with a capital G. And breathe that memory in. Breathe in the memory of feeling at one with the universe. Breathe in the memory of feeling beloved. Breathe in the memory of feeling yourself called by name, known deeply, understood, even if it was only for a moment. And notice what comes. Notice what images arise in your mind. And you might even want to take out pen, piece of paper, and just jot them down. Sketch it as fast as you can, or just a few words to recapture that image. I felt at home when. I felt beloved when. I felt known and held when. And let it just really penetrate into your body as I sing this chant. Maria Magdalene, Maria Magdalena, I wanted to begin with you with an experience of what I call the Magdalene path, not just an idea, but an embodied feeling that connects us to bodies, to our imaginations, to what the Greeks called the nous, which is just such a key part of her teaching, to notice when we return to the good and we return to our hearts, what images arise. And if we follow that thread, how it might lead us back home, home to ourselves, home to a deeper knowing of Yeshua, which is how I like to call Jesus these days by his Aramaic name, home to the heart of God. And this path of remembrance and returning to goodness and imagination, that is what I would call the Celtic braid that defines Mary Magdalene's teachings across the centuries to the people who followed in her footsteps. And we're going to just taste a little bit of what a big family tree that is. The mystics who have followed in her path. The hard part about this for me is just going to be that I want to tell you so much. I'm running a 9-month course right now called the Beehive. And the Beehive, we have 6 hours a month of 2 hours of chapel and 2 hours of seminar and then an hour and a half in study groups. And so it's a little bit tantalizing and a little bit hard right now. I feel like what I have to do is think of myself as a chef who's giving you a sampler plate in a amuse-bouche, if you will. But hopefully, this is going to be something that ignites your own curiosity for you to explore further. So I'm going to give you one instruction as we dive into the material. Don't worry about remembering it all. There's a lot. There's a videotape. You can go back. You can watch it. You can watch it. You can watch it again. What I want you to pay attention to is just what plucks the strings of your own heart. What plucks the strings of your own heart? And especially if you have an embodied response to anything, an image or a part of the story that I'm about to share with you, if you find a moment, where you get goosebumps or your throat gets constricted, or you might even find tears coming into your eyes, pay attention. Pay attention. The wisest spiritual direction that I ever had was with an African nun at a bus stop while we were waiting to go to Taizé. And she said to me, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I don't really know. The only thing I know is that every time I sing the song Ubi Caritas, Ubi Caritas, et amo. Every time I sing that song, I cry." And she said, vous êtes une Madeleine, vous êtes une Madeleine. And she got so excited and she explained to me that when we cry in response to liturgy or beauty, that is the Magdalene path, and that those tears are our royal road to God. And she said to me, "You must always follow your tears." Now we have to have discernment, as Justin knows from John Cassian. We really need to have discernment to know, are those tears of anger, self-pity, other things. But if it's a response, if we learn to respond, if we learn to know what the heart is telling us when our throat constricts, when we have the goosebumps, when we have the tears coming, and it's the great mystery. I love that the early Christian word for the Eucharist was the mystery. And if we feel that mystery pressing and coming through from the inside out in our body, that's a way that God speaks to us. So pay attention as I tell you this story, which is my path of discovery, not finished by a long stretch. I will always be a beginner in the school of love of Mary Magdalene and Yeshua. But notice if there's something that calls to you, that knocks on the door of your heart. And I would really encourage you then to follow that thread. Read books, research, go to these places, and see what else will be revealed. I have 3 master's degrees and a PhD, and all of them together are not worth what I experienced when I set my foot on the Pilgrim Trail and walked in the footsteps of Francis and Mary Magdalene and learned a very different kind of knowing. A gnosis that led me to things that I couldn't find in books because they weren't written in books, at least not in the English language from my time that were accessible. So I really want to invite you to pay attention to that. And with all of that preamble then, I just want to make sure that we can see. Are you able to see the screen here? Okay. So this is one of these images of Mary Magdalene that I was really happy to discover. And it's an image, I think it's from the 16th century, anonymous. If it's not, please write me and tell me if you discover the name. But so many of these art pieces are not given names. But what we see here, I want you to just notice and just drink it in before I start naming it. Just notice what you notice. In fact, I'm just going to invite Julie and Owen and Justin to pop in right now. What do you see in this picture before you? What stands out?
The first thing that pops out to me is the rapt attention of everybody around her.
Great. And what do you notice about everybody around her? What are you seeing?
Men and women.
Men and women.
It's both.
It's both. And young and
And
old.
old, yes, exactly.
And where are they?
In a forest.
They're in a forest. There's you can see the water in the distance. And where, instead of a pulpit, what do you see Mary Magdalene surrounded by?
Trees. Yeah, nature.
Nature. Yeah. And the people themselves are also of different classes. We can see more noble garb in the front, but as we get in the back, it's more of a peasant garb. So it's an image of universality that is connected with nature. And where she is preaching and teaching from, and notice that, just take this posture. I think it's really important when working with art as a spiritual practice to actually embody the art that you're seeing. So notice that what she has is she has her hand on her heart, right? One hand on her heart, and the other hand is touching the tree, touching the tree. So you could just spend an hour thinking about that, right? Like, what does that signify? What does that mean for you in your own life to embody things in such a way that your feet are on the earth? You're not elevated, as at this time that this painting was created. Priests were in the pulpit looking down on the congregation, and there was this great big division. But she's actually surrounded. She's in the heart of a community, surrounded by nature. I think that that's an incredible image to nourish, to return to. And for me, this image then speaks to so much about what I'll call the Magdalene path. And I'm teaching this 9-month class, and part in the beginning was the very, very hard couple of sessions in which we were looking at, how did the canonical gospels get chosen? And what was early Christianity like? And what was it like after Emperor Constantine adopted it? And how did the early Christian movement, a Jewish movement, end up becoming an imperial top-down religion? And so I like to say that in the first few centuries, there were different paths that were walking, that were people were coming. And then between the second and the, later centuries, there started to emerge this division of what I think of as two roads. And they hinge on some of these questions. Is spiritual authority out there, or is it in here? Out there or in here? What is the role of women in the church? What is the role of lay people in the church? Does the human soul contain a spark of divine goodness, or is it utterly depraved and corrupt? And if we are mortally ill, how are we healed? How are we healed? Are we healed because we confess a creed and we are forgiven by clergy? Or are we healed by spiritual practices that align our hearts with the good? So I love Jeremy McCulloch's phrase. He wrote this epic book that some of you might have read called Christianity, the First 3,000 Years. And one line that just leapt up at me is that the Desert Fathers and Mothers, developed this tradition that was the silent rebellion against what was happening in Rome. I love that, silent rebellion. So there's the fork in the road. There's the desert spirituality of the fathers and mothers. There's the road that goes to Celtic spirituality. And then there's the fork in the road that got adopted as the imperial church. And part of what I'm interested in as a historian is getting back to that place before we had the two forks in the road, and looking at what was alive there and seeing what that might say to us. And part of what I love to work with, and this gets to this aspect of balancing the masculine and the feminine. We'll return to this at the end of our conversation today. But one of my degrees is in psychology, and I did a lot of work in attachment theory and a lot of work in the brain and how this is configured. And the short answer is, our brain is like a walnut, and it has two halves to it, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere is more logical and linear, and it thinks in black and white, and it thinks in words. And then the right hemisphere, which is much more emotional and intuitive, thinks in pictures. There is a bridge between the two, and the bridge is poetry and music. Interesting. That activates both hemispheres of the brain. But we could think about this as word, image. And when we hear, as Hildegard of Bingen knew, she said, from the eye to the mind, from the ear to the heart, about texts. And when we read things aloud or when we chant them aloud, it works more of our whole brain. But if we're only reading it in black and white alphabetical script, it goes to our left brain. And things get a little wonky. They get very imbalanced. One of the reasons I love the Middle Ages is there's this balance between image and text. There you have the beautiful illuminated manuscripts. So this is a whole other thing to explore, but one of the things to know is that it wasn't before the year 1000 that the image that we think of as the dominant image of Christianity, which is the crucified man on the cross, bleeding and suffering, was the dominant image. And before that, there were other images that spoke to people. when they would look around. And I find it fascinating to just collect what were the earliest Christian symbols before the Bibles existed as a canon, before things were written down. And one of the images is the one on the right. So let's just play a little with this too. I just want to do some associations. So just pop in, both of you. Owen, Justin, don't be shy. Give me 3 words when you see the image of Jesus suffering with his ribs and bleeding on the cross on the left. 3 words that you associate with that image.
Misery.
Misery.
Misery is the word I associate with that image. Yeah. Suffering.
Misery, suffering. A lot of people associate it with atonement or sin. Does that resonate as a neural pathway? And then just look at the image on the right and let's just describe what you're seeing, especially if this is a new symbol for you. What do you see? It's carved in stone. We'll come back to that in a minute.
Hearts.
Yeah, 3 hearts.
I see symmetry. I see symmetry. I see circles. I see floral motifs,
Right.
and yet grounded.
Yeah, yeah. So this symbol on the right is the symbol of Magdalenian spirituality. We've actually been recovering in the 1st century synagogue in Magdala at a Franciscan center right now. This is what is carved on the rock everywhere. And it comes from this symbol from sacred geometry of the vesica piscis, also known as the bladder of the whale, also known as the mandorla or almond. And while we got the ichthys or the fish, the Jesus fish on the right from this, it's about, and just make this with your hands right now, everyone. Take 2 circles and then put them overlapping. And again, this would be a whole course to talk about what is symbolized by this holding the tension of the opposites and its role in medieval history in particular. But this is where we get our Jesus fish from, is actually from this symbol right here. But it's also the seed of this. And this is the pattern known to Leonardo da Vinci and the Renaissance, but also centuries before that, all the way back to Pythagoras, as far as I've traced it, 6th century BC. And it's the seed of life. And it's this idea that if we hold the tension of the opposites and we find the place to go in that, it will open up within us a flowering. And so it's a very different image about what enables our full flowering, this image that spiritual practice can enable our hearts and the seed of goodness within us to fully flower. And when we do that, it becomes these symbols that then expand and expand and expand and expand to become the germ of all life. If you're excited by this, go read Constructing the Universe by Michael Schneider's. Go explore sacred geometry. It's amazing. But that was the Magdalenian symbol. And we find it in Magdala, in the Holy Land, in the 1st century BC. And then I've traced it. It would take hours to explain this, but I've traced it all throughout the places throughout Europe, in northern Italy, and in France, and in England, where a particular lineage following the teachings of Mary Magdalene flourished for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. And yet this image, and this is an image of Mary Magdalene that is also dates from early centuries, of the woman proclaiming with her open-hearted, just do this gesture right here. And now imagine yourself opening and flowering. Imagine yourself as that symbol of the flower of life. And just notice how that makes you feel. That Jesus becomes the great teacher who enables us to flower in our fullness. That the pathway to at-one-ment, at-one-ment, comes from reuniting with the root of what's good and true and beautiful in our hearts and following that path so that we can connect with others in their full flowering. What a different pathway that is from original sin. What a different pathway that is from sacrificial, vicarious atonement. And this pathway, although it has been hidden, this particular image that you see of Mary Magdalene, there open like this, is literally hidden in the dark behind bars. Yet another image that I had to take my cell phone, put it, my hand literally through bars, put on a light, and then be able to take the picture of. Because symbolically and quite literally, these images, these stories were locked away for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. But they persist. And one of the reasons why the book that I'm working on right now is called Mary Magdalene, the Mother Tree of Mysticism, is that we will find, if we follow this red thread, we follow this red thread over and over throughout the centuries, that we'll discover that so much of her teaching, so much of her presence, so much of her as a saint who became the mystic mother of people like St. Francis of Assisi and Teresa of Avila and Hildegard of Bingen and the Cloud of Unknowing and Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena and the Beguines and on and on and on. So even though much of the story was cut out, we can actually piece back together how important she was as the mother tree by looking at the circle that surrounds her of the mystics who have followed quite literally sometimes in her footsteps. This is one of the other images I had to put my phone through in Rome, through bars, and her very name was erased from this picture. It says Saint Barnabas, the Apostle, and another saint. And unless you know Latin, and unless you had a cell phone, and unless you were like me and just were just persistent, you wouldn't know that the book that she's pointing to here, and we know it's her because of certain visual symbols that are associated with her at the time of this painting: long, unbound hair, scarlet red cloak, green sleeves. But the book that she's pointing to, barely legible, says Maestra Apostolorum, the feminine form of the teacher of the apostles. And so much of my life has been, much of our times has been, so many people are doing this wonderful research now of filling in what has been cut out of the picture. If you take your finger and you touch the screen and you go to the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus, and now take your finger and notice that there is a gaping hole. There is a gaping hole. And the story of how she was cut out of the Christian story and replaced with an image of an adulteress, a prostitute, a sexual sinner, is one of the great stories of our time that needs reclaiming in every single church, in every single spiritual direction office. That we reclaim her original role as the Maestra Apostolorum, the teacher to the teachers, the one who then brings the good news on Easter Sunday to the disciples who have fled, who have abandoned, who have denied, and who have betrayed Jesus. But her story is one that, while she, if you look at all four canonical gospels, there she is. She's the one consistent piece that people agree on was there present at the cross. But over time, what happens is she moves from being there present at the cross and at the resurrection. And then other people end up in the story who weren't even there. And then she gets taken out. So we have Mary Magdalene with the long red unbound hair here at the foot of the cross. And now St. Francis is there imitating her, which is wonderful, which he did. But notice that over time, Mary Magdalene in the red cloak gets pushed to the very far edges of the picture, and other people take her place. And that's part of the story too. But to go back to this image, if you do what I call the work that I'm called to do, spiritual archaeology, being a spiritual archaeologist will carry you and you will find clues to piece together this puzzle. And part of the pieces that I've pieced together over the past 22 years now are found at La Sainte-Baume. And they are in the French traditions that say that Mary Magdalene, after the events of the crucifixion and the resurrection, first went to Alexandria, Egypt, and then came and landed in this place here. And eventually, after teaching and preaching, as we see here, not in a synagogue, not in a church, but out in nature and in forums. And that eventually, when she was being hunted, as were her brother Lazarus and sister Martha and other people who were in this boat of Bethany, she found her way to La Sainte-Baume. And it was here that, according to the French stories and the oral tradition and the tales that were written down, beginning in the 2nd and 3rd century, we don't have 1st century accounts, but we have some that are remarkably old. And here she went into the forest. And it was here then that she lived that life as a hermit, as a contemplative, where she engaged in spiritual practices. And if you walk in her footsteps now, you'll see this beautiful forest that says the zone of silence. And you'll cross this threshold into the zone of silence. And it's about an hour and a half's journey. And it is amazing. This forest, which was there, it was dedicated to the Greek goddess Artemis for 700 years before Mary Magdalene arrived. So it has always been associated with the sacred feminine. And as you walk through this forest, what you hear, the sound of the mist dripping from the leaves and the bird's song, it's just incredible, but no human voices unless there are pilgrims going up the path. And you find this well of pure water that is cool and refreshing. Pilgrims stop and they bathe their faces and wash their hands and drink of this. And then they follow these steep steps where the Beatitudes are carved in stone along the pathway. And they come to this gate, and we'll return to the gate in a moment. And they pass through it into the monastery. They pass the more modern sculpture of this Pietà, the Virgin Mary holding Yeshua, and Mary Magdalene cradling his feet next to the rose, that symbol again of her, the rose, that six-petaled flower. And then we enter into the sanctuary, and it is as if time has stopped. This is the cave that, according to legend, she spent the last 33 years of her life in silent prayer. And pilgrims now then light those candles, and oh, it really feels like you have traveled across time into this mystic portal. And this is the place from which, according to the legends, the angels themselves lifted her up 7 times a day in song. We find that particular image in the Basilica of St. Francis, who was indeed one of her followers. And so centuries upon centuries upon centuries of saints and pilgrims and ordinary people have made this journey in her footsteps to pray and meditate and contemplate. And one of Justin's favorites and my favorites, John Cassian, is largely responsible for this being a pilgrim path, that he arrived here and he instituted celebrations of her feast day, July 22nd, where pilgrims would walk from all over France and walk this journey chanting the Psalms. As the deer longs for the water brook. They would have chanted that in Latin, of course, though. But they would chant the Psalms that were associated with Mary Magdalene's feast day through this portal. And you can see then this lineage, that this has been a monastery surrounding this cave, tended by the Cassianite monks at first in the year 415. For 654 years, the monks of John Cassian tended this, guarding her relics, or at least what they believed were her relics. And then the Benedictines came, and then after the events of the Albigensian Crusades and war and the medieval Inquisitions, the Dominicans took over, and they were there until the French Revolution, and then they came back and are there present now. And so much of the writings and the contemplations that Blessed John Cassian, who's revered as a saint in the Orthodox tradition and who's included in the Philokalia in his writings, all of those beautiful works that he wrote that influenced Dante, that just ripple across the centuries, were written after he was contemplating in that cave, or written while he was contemplating in that cave, which gives me goosebumps to think about. The other site where they were written, there you can see the monastery from a distance over that line. And that monastery was sent there, and it was a double monastery of men and women together, modeled after what he had learned while he was in the deserts of Egypt, gathering the stories of the desert fathers and mothers. But he came here to 2 sites, 2 monasteries established, La Sainte-Baume, and then this one, Abbey Saint-Victoire in Marseille. And why did he go there? Well, Marseille was the other place that Mary Magdalene was said to have preached and taught with her brother Lazarus, who was, according to legend, the first bishop of Marseille. And this is the lower church where John Cassian's relics are. that you can see right below the cross that's there. That's the altar where this was the first church, on the site of the first church that he had. And then in the crypt, you have these amazing images. That's Lazarus on the left. And then the image of God, the Almighty, on the temple above a tree of life. And then the serpent. I love that they have both sides, animal and, and the other images of nature, of foliage, right there above the Almighty, embracing it all. And then on the right, a little hard to see, is Mary Magdalene with her long hair. One other part of this is actually the jar of balm, spikenard, and the oils that she also brought to the tomb. And then above that is actually an 8-petaled star that you see right there. But again, there's no crucifix here. There's the serpent, there's the tree of life. But again, how different this feels, right? Different, very, very different to feel this. And throughout France, there's so many places then where if we follow the symbols and we follow the storylines and we follow the liturgy lines and the songs and the prayers, we'll find how important she was. This is the other cathedral where relics of Lazarus are entombed, and it's the cathedral of the Big Mary, it says. And one of the things that I absolutely love about this, even though I think it's 19th century, but they somehow intuitively preserved things about how important she is. In the French tradition, and this is very controversial, and I don't want to go too far afield with this, but in the French tradition that I've spent so many decades researching, Mary Magdalene is Mary of Bethany. She becomes Mary Magdalene after she anoints Yeshua, just as Jesus becomes the Christ, the Christos one, when he is anointed. Mary of Bethany becomes Mary Magdalene, the tower, after this act of anointing. So this is the French story of this. And so you'll see the image of Yeshua with Lazarus, Martha, and Mary there as one of the images in this tomb of Lazarus. And I'm going to call your attention to the figures that are above the big, big archway. And I love that it's dark and white, black and white, black and white. So that, again, a balancing aspect. But notice that we have Jesus, of course, in the center, and you will see at his right hand Peter with his keys, right? But then if you go beyond that, you will find Lazarus with his hands preaching, right? And you will also find Mary Magdalene on the far left and Martha on the far right. So we have the women as part of the disciples here, as part of this story, which of course they were cut out of. If you go to the Vatican, it's only men that are in the statues on top there. But the influence of Magdalene, the preacher and teacher, is attested even by the Dominicans, who launched an enormous persecution in her name that just caused untold horrors. It's been called the first Holocaust in France. And it was launched on her feast day to people who were following her path, who differed from the Orthodox teaching. But even within Orthodoxy, the memory of Mary Magdalene, the teacher and preacher, is preserved. And so there's this teaching of her written in the chronicle of her life in the Golden Legend, that her words were like honey, and people who heard her teaching, their hearts were open to the sweetness and goodness of the teaching of her gospel. But this site here, Lorenz Abbey, I was so surprised to find that under John Cassian's influence, the pilgrimage on her feast day would occur, that the monks of Lorenz Abbey would follow this pathway. And there are many saints in this tradition, but the one that's the most surprising monk who studied here, who then learned how to bring the contemplative life into his teaching and preaching, is St. Patrick. And this is where he became a monk. And if you look at the column there, what do you see on the right image? It's the 6-petaled rose, again, right there. And that 6-petaled rose adorns the chapter house that in later centuries was where chapters of the Rule of Benedict were read. And I am deeply, deeply enmeshed formed and shaped by Benedictine spirituality. And so I knew very well that in the Rule of Benedict, it says, this is a little rule for beginners. And if you want to progress further in the spiritual life, you will need to read the writings of John Cassian, the Institutes and the Conferences, the two works that were written in France and the places associated with Mary Magdalene. And so here in Lorenz Abbey, you can see on the site there, it's in French and also Gaelic, how it memorializes St. Patrick coming here and learning to become a monk in the 5th century. And that he would then, later on, he would have had that connection with John Cassian. He would have had the Benedictine rule would have been followed along this same pilgrim pathway, how the Benedictines were schooled in so many cases, first in France, and then they went out. And the legends that I'm going to explore later in the year, some with Justin, talking about the Celtic path, that in Britain, they claim that St. Patrick came here first before he landed in Ireland, that he came from France and he arrived here, and he arrived to find an abbey already in place, Glastonbury Abbey, that had also been connected to these stories of Mary Magdalene through Joseph of Arimathea. And they claim that she arrived here with him before she went back to France, and that is one reason why the abbey, which is in ruins now, thanks to Henry VIII, but why it's on Magdalen Street, although often in the Middle Ages it was pronounced Magdalen Street. Magdalen and Magdalen is the English pronunciation in the Middle Ages. And this is the chapel for pilgrims that was once called Magdalen Chapel and now is called St. Margaret Chapel, named after St. Margaret of Scotland, who renovated the Pilgrim Chapel in Mary Magdalene's name. And if you go into St. Patrick's Chapel, which is the only one that remains, the only intact building of Glastonbury Abbey, you see Mary Magdalene here with 6 of the 7 demons leaving her. I'm not quite sure why there isn't a 7th, but you will also see the jar there of balm. And that pathway then is part of this story that is the great quest of my life, how it went through this lineage of Patrick and Bridget in Ireland, and then over to Iona, where they also have Mary Magdalene legends, and from Iona to Lindisfarne, and from Lindisfarne it went over back into mainland Europe, including places where Hildegard of Bingen was, where she was in an anchorite cell with Utah. The foundations of that were an earlier Celtic monastery that had been brought about by Lindisfarne monks who had come from Iona, and then the Iona monks. And so you could see that there's this whole family tree. And then if we follow the family tree, we also find St. Francis. And St. Francis, who had a profound relationship to Mary Magdalene, and when he would withdraw into the forest for contemplation, he would go to the forests of Laverna. And the only thing that was present in his cave was this statue, a statue of Mary Magdalene with her jar of healing balm. And if we turn to the writings then, well, before we do that, this is one of the reasons why in the lower church of Assisi, in the Basilica of St. Francis, that you will find where his body lay before his place was finished, was the fresco cycle of Mary Magdalene that's drawn from the Golden Legend. And this one of a Franciscan cardinal, kneeling and kissing Mary Magdalene's hand in a gesture that to me seems remarkably like a cardinal kissing a pope's ring. And it made me see cardinal red in a very, very different way. And I'll call your attention to the very top and bottom of this image where you see the Star of David in red and white. You can see that Star of David in white. And what I was just blown away to learn about is in one tradition that's connected with Mary Magdalene, the Valentinian tradition, this interlocking of these 2 triangles has a different meaning. And particularly in the Middle Ages in Chartres Cathedral, this symbol meant pointing upwards, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, pointing downwards, Holy Mother, Daughter, and Soul. So above, below, earth, linked together. I still want to learn more about that, but I thought that was fascinating. A masculine triangle and a feminine triangle joined in union. And then from that, the teaching was that when we unite the masculine and feminine elements within ourselves, that we can open and flower in our fullness. And that's going to bring us to some things that we'll come to in just a moment. So just to say, if we follow this thread in the writings of the Beguines, like Mathilde de Magdeburg, Hadwich, Marguerite Porete, if we follow in the footsteps Catherine of Siena, before she confronted the Pope in Avignon during the schism, she went and she prayed and meditated in Mary Magdalene's cave in La Beaume. That the mystics across the centuries have embraced Mary Magdalene as their spiritual mother. Teresa of Avila had a vision of Mary Magdalene being given to her as her spiritual mother. And in that contemplative place of silence, in psalms, in prayer, and returning to the goodness, all these saints also opened and flowered in their fullness. And for me, that is so consonant. I love to begin all of my teachings with the canonical text, and we notice that what they all agree on is that she was able to be present at the foot of Christ being crucified, and then in the garden for the resurrection, life and death. She unites the opposites within her, grief and joy. She holds it all within her being. And to me, that's so consonant then, and not at all at odds with the Gospels that have been recovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945. And I'll just refer to everybody to A New Testament. If you're not familiar with this, it holds the story that we're familiar with the canonical texts, but it expands it by asking the question of a committee of priests and theologians and academics and even a rabbi, what books do we need to know now? If we really want to be followers of Jesus, what books do we need to know? And this committee that includes such notable people as Karen King and Elaine Pagels, Hal Tausig, and so many other interspiritual, I would say, Christians, said that there's 10 other texts that we need. And in those texts, Mary Magdalene has a primary place in some of them. And this word that's associated with her is this word anthropos, meaning fully human. Sometimes it's been mistranslated as male. So I like to work on correcting this, because one of my favorite texts is the Gospel of Thomas, that some scholars think actually is earlier than the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or John. And in the last Logian, Peter, it shows this conflict with Mary. And Jesus comes to her defense and says, I myself will lead her so that she might become fully anthropos. And some of the English translation says, I myself will lead Mary so that she will become male. And I have to say, I really disagree with that. I think that what isn't spoken is, to just be honest, is that Jesus would have said, and Peter, I will lead you to become female so that then you will be fully human too. That in the image as I understand it, the anthropos is that place where we have both reason and logic and deep emotion and intuition. And that when we unite those together in our being, then we are whole. We are whole, as Yeshua calls us to be whole, not perfect in that word that also is in this translation, but whole, that we are called to become whole. And that word anthropos then is such an important word to claim, and is so connected to Mary Magdalene as this image of wholeness. So the other book that the New Orleans committee included that they were the most excited about was the Gospel of Mary. And while I think that their translation is a good place to begin, I would really recommend that any listener turn their hearts to the text by Jean-Yves Lelou, who is now an Orthodox priest, but who was schooled as a Jungian psychotherapist, and who before that was a Dominican confessor in the cave of Mary Magdalene at La Sainte Baume. And he himself received a vision that he needed to to depart to become more whole, and his work has been to bring the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary to our world with translation and union-informed commentary. And so here's just a few of these, it's only 7 pages long. The actual text is only 7 pages long, but it is earth-shattering in its implications. And I found people can return to this and study it for a year. And oh, the doorways it opens in their hearts. So I'll just, actually, I want to invite one of you to read it because I've been talking long enough. So would one of you three read this aloud, please?
I'll go ahead.
Thank you.
It feels like it needs to come from a feminine voice. The Blessed One greeted them all, saying, "Peace be with you. May my peace arise and be fulfilled within you. Be vigilant and allow no one to mislead you by saying, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is,' for it is within you the Son of Man, child of humanity, dwells. This is why the good has come into your midst to reunite you with your roots."
So just those 2 sayings, just notice how you feel. Come back to your body. I put child of humanity in parentheses. That's Karen King's translation. That phrase, I love to look at it both ways, but just notice, like, this is the teaching of Jesus here, is to reunite us with our roots. And then Mary Magdalene stands up in this text. After he departs, the disciples are plunged into fear. And they ask her and they say, "You know things that we don't know. Could you teach us what the Savior has taught you?" And she begins to describe for them this vision in which she enters into this realm of the nous and sees him in this imaginal realm, and hears this teaching in which she has to confront within herself the powers of darkness and wrath and hot-tempered certainty and anger. And they kind of map on to Dante's 7 deadly sins in the Divine Comedy, which itself was informed by John Cassian's writings, which he got from La Sainte Baume. So there's a whole lineage there that I'm just dying to explore with Justin one day, like a huge year-long class on that, right? But as Mary Magdalene ascends and confronts these powers and wrath and darkness, and she then finds herself in the realm of silence. And then it says, "And then she became silent, for it was in silence that the teacher spoke to her." So I have goosebumps all over my body whenever I talk about this, because if we talk about the contemplative path being so much about that Hezekiah path of going inward to do this difficult work of discernment, and then to find the place through connecting beyond form, first with images and form, and then beyond form, beyond image, to the great silence. Mary Magdalene is the great exemplar of that pathway, the profound exemplar of that pathway. And we know then from the recovery of the Gospel of Mary, which was in 3 different copies across 2 different centuries, in Coptic and in Greek, that this was a teaching that was widely disseminated for a while, and then hidden, and then lost, and then buried. And one of the things that I am so grateful for in our apocalyptic times is that this is being unveiled, that we are actually being able to see this and read it in our own language for the first time. This, by the way, is one of these places that is an extraordinary place of imagination. This is the monastery, the French Orthodox monastery of Saint-Michel-du-Var, where Jean-Yves Leloup, the translator who came from La Beaume, is an Orthodox monk. I love it that they have swans out front. In part, that's a nod to the Gospel of Mary was found wrapped in swan feathers. And if you, like Justin, know about the Celtic path, you know that the Druids taught in cloaks of swan feathers. So isn't that an interesting symbol? And they plucked their harps with quills from swans. So what a symbol that is. And so it took my breath away when I walked in and I saw this image that I had been teaching about in words for years, of Mary Magdalene as a towering figure, like we saw that image in the Basilica of St. Francis, the towering figure in which the cardinal is kneeling, that she is a towering figure who underneath her cloak of compassion is a mystic path of those who had followed the path of the heart throughout the centuries. And there you see John Cassian in the gray cloak and Saint Benedict afterwards, and on and on and on throughout the centuries. Arriving in the rudderless boat on the left image with Lazarus and Martha and the other companions to bring this teaching filled with the nectar of sweet honey, a message that invites us alchemically to find where Christ lives in our hearts, not an image of suffering and torture, but an image of glory and beauty and transfiguration. An image where we too become anthropos, where we become anthropos, held in the hands of the divine, masculine and feminine both, invited into this great dance of creation. So you can tell there's so much more I want to share with you, but hopefully that will be a teaser taste of the Magdalene path and what it might offer you as spiritual directors to connect with the nous, to connect through Lectio with the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Thomas, to read these writings, but feel them in a different way. The last thing I'll say before we go into conversation, and I just have a few more images of this. Oh, these are images of Magdala, just so you know. Here's that synagogue stone that has the flower of life. There's Magdala there. And there's the center. Look it up and you'll find just some amazing work done by Franciscans now to also reclaim the women. This is the image of the boat, like that we just saw, the rudderless boat as well. There's a relic from La Sainte Baume here inside this boat, by the way, to commemorate those two boats from the shores of Galilee and then Baume. And then this image of Magdalene and Yeshua together, reaching out with one another. I love that, where you feel their relationship together and her as the apostle to the apostles. It's really important to reclaim the images that are accurate, not Magdalene, the bare-bosomed woman, the penitent prostitute, but Magdalene, the faithful person at the foot of the cross. And then also the archetypally true images, this one by Sue Ellen Parkinson, who was able, and this is part of why I think she should be the patron saint of hospice workers, for spiritual directors, that what is it to imagine when you're confronting death? To imagine Mary Magdalene behind you. This is what Catherine of Siena did. She imagined Mary Magdalene behind her as she went to accompany prisoners to be guillotined. So imagine that. Imagine. So spiritual directors, this is my impassioned plea. I showed you images in the beginning of Mary Magdalene being cut out of the picture. I'm going to ask you to just look deeply in your own hearts at your own liturgies and notice, maybe it's different, but in the liturgies that I grew up with in the Episcopal Church, we don't tell the story about Mary Magdalene being present at the foot of the cross. We actually don't even read the story of her being there at the garden where Jesus calls her by name and she's commissioned. Instead, we tell the story of Peter denying him, Judas betraying him, Pontius Pilate washing his hands, and all of the men in the crowd crying, "Crucify him." But if we go to the oldest canonical text, Mark, there are women there, women who most congregations don't even know their names. Marie Jacobet, Marie Salome, who were in the French stories, companions of Mary Magdalene, in the rudderless boat, arriving on the shores of France, where they brought the good news. The good news that inside each human heart is a spark of divine goodness, that if we turn our hearts through spiritual practice and silent contemplation, we too can flower in our goodness. What would it be like? What would the world be like if we reclaimed walking in the footsteps of the biblical Mary Magdalene, present for suffering and death, yes, but also able to turn our hearts to the good, also doing the difficult work of confronting what is dark within ourselves to arrive in that place of silence where we can hear the still small voice whispering to us, reuniting us with the roots of goodness within us.
There are so many threads that I could pick up on that I resonate so much with. In my spiritual direction program, I read Cynthia Bourgeau's Mary Magdalene. Don't remember the exact title, but it was a profound book, leaning into the fourth way and reading into the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. One of the reasons why I decided to become a spiritual director is that I've had to do most of this type of work on my own because it's not taught in church. And I want it available and people to understand it. And before your presentation, I was saying that I'm a scientist, artist, and mystic. And most of my life I spent in the science, very analytical, logical brain. And it was through embodiment and art that I was able to balance. And once I began, and the balance also was included embodiment practices. And through those, you had mentioned Mary Magdalene ties between death and rebirth with the grief. And that's been a way that I've been able to lean into and learn from and metabolize my grief.
Yeah.
And with some of these mystical experiences that I've had, I've touched within the imaginal realm. And in your presentation, I actually saw some of the places that I have visited in the imaginal realm. And honestly, I'm kind of blown away. And I would love to talk to you on the side about some integrating of those and what I'm being called to do.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
But it really is that tension between the masculine and the feminine that we need. And when they're both healthy, we can do amazing things because we need the internal going into the soul. And that inspires us to go out. So like the heroine's journey, is an internal journey that allows us to go out. It's not going out and then coming home. It's going internal and then being able to go out. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it just keeps circling back and around. And we need those internal times. And then we need to be out in the world. And to be out in the world in an authentic and grounded way, we needed some solid footing to stand on.
Yeah.
And that solid footing is not that we're bad or there's anything wrong with us. It's standing in our own power, which is as a divine child of God, the child of humanity. And when we remember that internally and can reclaim that flame that's within us, then we can go out and really work on healing in the world. And we're not getting it in church. And so I'm hoping as I meet with people individually, my path is going to be completely different than somebody else's path. But there are touchstones along the way that are just not provided in society or church. And yet there's this deep longing for it.
Yeah.
Deep longing.
Such a deep longing and such a profound and deep longing. And I think the more we can turn to nature for images of this, the better we will be. This is why my 9-month program is called the Beehive, because it's not about people coming and having one view and becoming a church of this. It's about the cross-pollination, about each person seeking out what is calls to them in their heart for what's beautiful, and then realizing that if we bring that back and we share it together, that it enriches us all, and that your path will be very different. Maybe what plucks on the strings of your heart, is reading John Cassian's work, and what is for somebody else is learning liturgical dance, and another one is setting the Aramaic Lord's Prayer to a chant that they compose, and that there can be this multiplicity and diversity that can enrich and nourish us all. Because if that central teaching is there is this spark of divine goodness inside of our heart, and we have a lot of work to do. We do. I don't want to deny that, it's like there is discernment that needs to happen. There is a lot of internal work we need to do in our world. And I think that that's part of also of the Magdalene message when we look at the Gospel of Mary. It's like as she goes through and she confronts those things, we all need to do that work too, And when we hold that both, but from the place that what is most true within us is goodness. And what is most true about each person that we meet is goodness. And then it really reframes things like, well, how can we let that seed of goodness flourish? How is it being choked by weeds? How is it being overshadowed by darkness? In what ways is it not being nourished? That if we actually go to the Gospel of John and say, okay, Jesus is the gardener. She didn't make a mistake. Jesus is the gardener, right? And how are we the flowers that we need to be tending our garden? I think it just opens up a whole new way of harmony in the world that we desperately need to return to nature. And by the way, in terms of side conversation, Julie, I'd love to have a side conversation with you. I have an invitation waiting for you. I just had one I need one person to fill a hole for a spiritual director or a minister. But what you spoke to, I have in this program, I'm working with 40 people right now, the vast majority of whom have some sort of theological background, who've been to seminary or who've been on a pulpit. And one woman said she was a Methodist minister for 35 years. And when we started going through the Magdalene stuff, she just began sobbing, saying, why didn't they teach me this? Why didn't they teach me this? This was never part of my education, any of this, the Lectio Divina, the Visio Divina, these contemplative practices that when we trace their roots back are connected to John Cassian, and by way of John Cassian to Mary Magdalene herself. Like, why wasn't this part of it? And then why didn't I actually see the women that are in the canonical text in the first place? Like, they were just never mentioned. And it changes everything. We haven't even gotten to the Gospel of Mary. We're only in the canonicals, and already people are crying and sobbing because they've never seen the women that are actually there. They've never been mentioned. They've never been talked about. All of the attention has been on the path that denies, betrays, and abandons. And if you focus on that, think about that psychologically. If we're focusing on the disciples who betrayed, denied, and abandoned, that doesn't create very good neural pathways in our own mind. If what we're only doing is we're only chanting the words on Palm Sunday of the violence of the crowd, and not imagining that as Jesus was on the cross saying, my God, you have forsaken me, there was a whole community of women who were chanting with him, my God, you have you forsaken us? Doesn't that shift something? It shifts everything for me. If I were to imagine myself on the cross, however I would feel, to know that the people who loved me were still there looking at me with love, it changes everything. I'm sorry, I'm getting pretty teary now.
Well, I would say the one thing that this adds a layer to is that one of the things that within Christianity, I had a hard time with the crucifixion and Jesus dying on the cross for our sins. And when I leaned into original goodness, it changed things a lot. And the way I was able to kind of reclaim that story was that it shows us the path of death, tomb time, or wilderness, and rebirth. And that we do that every day. in big and
It's the
small
human
ways.
journey. It's
It's the human journey. And when I can see that as Jesus showing us the way and the path through that, that's huge for me. But now to add Mary Magdalene as the loving presence holding that container at the same time, that's an additional
and
shift
not
that I think we need to know, is that we're being held, that we're not alone.
and
And
it's not just her. I want to underscore that.
right. It's
There are
this
other people
community.
there.
Right. So that actually adds so much more depth and loving arms to that path that it took me years to lean into seeing the gospel that way. So even within this short period of time today, it's added a layer, a shift that that fills my heart and needs to be shared.
Glad, so glad. Justin and Owen, I don't want the men to be shut out too. I want the male voices just as much.
The thing that really came out is I was trying to listen for what Mary Magdalene might be saying to me in my own practice as a spiritual director through that conversation, and what came up was what you had just mentioned, Julie, as well, of the of Mary as a presence, as a witness, a witnessing presence. And I think of, as a spiritual director, sometimes you got to give sort of hard advice or whatever every once in a while, but for the most part, the job is just to sort of get out of the way and to hold the space for someone, and to allow, the spirit to work within that space. And the image of Mary, and I hadn't ever thought of this, at both the crucifixion and the resurrection, being the one who's the closest, the first, the right there, at both those two things. I knew of them individually, but I just never thought of the connection between being at both and being the one named at both. And how when we witness, as I sit with people in spiritual direction, I sometimes like to remember that it's the presence of Christ before me, the person who I'm speaking with, whoever they are, regardless of anything, is the presence of Christ before me. And if I think of that imagery of being there for their crucifixion and for their resurrection, not orchestrating it in any way. I don't think Mary, you can tell me if there's a different tradition, but I don't think Mary was orchestrating it in any way, or she was really just there, which is all that it takes and what is the most important work. So I hope I can embody Mary, and I'll bring her to mind, and I'll say a little prayer asking for her help the next time I'm sitting with someone who's going through a crucifixion or a resurrection. And it makes me think just of a last thing to say when Paul says that we should weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. And I think of Mary weeping at the cross and rejoicing at the empty tomb. And how, if there was one scripture verse, I guess, to give as advice to any spiritual director, I think it might be that, to weep with those who weep and to rejoice with those who rejoice, and just to share and witness and be present. Maybe that's what came up for me.
Thank you, Justin. As you're talking, the question came to me. It's like, her most consistent symbol is the jar of balm. And if we were to say, like, what is the healing balm I can bring right now to this interaction, that would be a good question to hold in our hearts.
Yeah, that's one of the things that struck me too, is the healing balm, the healer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Over and over again.
Well, and it connects nicely, I think, to something Kayleen mentioned already, is the idea of and I know it connects deeply to Justin's work, the idea of the Irish penitential tradition being, not endless self-deprecation and self-loathing, but rather of bringing specific healing for specific expressions of woundedness.
Yeah.
And it connects to one of your first slides in the presentation of the phrasing really struck a chord in me, again, to borrow your language. If we are mortally ill, and that idea of sin as mortal illness, an illness, an illness that brings death into the world, according to certain interpretations of the tradition, is it's a very different way of orienting to the work, I think, than the way that the tradition of denial, betrayal, and abandonment tends to orient to the spiritual work.
Yeah.
There are so many pieces of your presentation that were super powerful for me. That language around the tradition of denial, betrayal, and abandonment. I mean, it hit me like a physical force in my chest when you said that. And it reminded me instantly of the language from the Dynamique about there are two ways, the way of life and the way of death. And it reminded me also of something I had thought of earlier when you were talking about the idea that Mary became Mary Magdalene became the tower when she anointed Christ, in a mirror image, interestingly, of Simon Peter becoming the rock when he confesses Christ, when he anoints him verbally. There's this like fascinating mirroring there that before you said that had never, ever, ever occurred to me. And even the language of Mary the tower and Peter the rock. That's it's such amazing duality that's sort of, I mean, always right there once you have certain pieces, a certain set of glasses with which to see it. But the idea, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I certainly don't want to besmirch anyone's religious or spiritual tradition, but in some ways, almost the idea that actually of those two ways, one of those was the way to life and one of those was the way to death, because it's the tradition, as near as we can tell, that seems to sort of pass through Peter onwards, that becomes imperial Christianity, which does seem to involve a great deal of death and destruction, and its kind of imperialistic.
Particularly for women.
Yeah, particularly for women. Um, but if I step back from the conceptual piece for a moment and speak at what feels most personal, the earthiness.
Yeah.
Um, spiritual language oftentimes, and for me, it was a very good thing for a long time, but it oftentimes is transcendent language. And it brings us away from the body and away from the earth and away from our brokenness and woundedness and character defects and the language of the 12-step tradition, and on and on and on, into something that's not here, it's out there. It brings us away from the limitations. But that language from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene about that is why the good has come into your midst to help you come back to your roots. That's not transcendent language. That's eminent language. That's the language of light and ground and of living things in all of their messiness and interconnectedness, where things die that other things may live. And then her connectedness to trees, where the tree sort of connects earth to heaven in this incredibly amazing sort of bridge that they are. And then 2 weeks ago, I herniated a disc, which for anyone out there considering it, don't do.
I have one, I know.
It's the worst thing. And but it was it laid me low, and I mean, it just me out. And they were talking about surgery and all these sorts of things in the sense of like, oh my gosh, like I don't know that my life, the way that I know it, is going to continue, really. And it raised these questions of like, well, if it can't, who do you want to be? And the language that came up for me was, I want to be an oak tree. I want to be an oak tree for people. if I can't move the way that I like to move, can I embody stillness? Can I grow my presence? Can I cultivate a space of refuge and sanctuary from the heat, from the storm?
Mm.
Um, can I create a place where people can sit and feel safe, even if only for a little while?
Mm.
And so that was all of those things coming together for me in a most transformative way. And I am deeply grateful. I did not know what to expect. I have to say the reviews on your website and the things that people have said about you in articles and elsewhere have talked about you being just a force of nature and this incredible teacher. And yeah, those are not lies. Like that was my experience of you. So thank you for sharing your gifts with us.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be with you. I'd love to. I just I just sort of fell in love with all of you today. And Justin, I still dream like next year, next Lent, let's do Cassian. Let's do let's do a whole thing about the virtues and the vices that weaves together Cassian and Hildegard and the Gospel of Mary, because there's such profound teaching here. And I just thank you for all that you are doing to bring to the world more resources for people to find their own inner strength. How we need that right now more than ever. How we need that more than ever. I wish I could stay with you longer. I've got another program at 10:30. So
Thank you.
Thank you
thank
so
you, thank
much.
you. And Julie, we'll be in touch about some, you said we'll have a side conversation. And Owen, prayers for your disc. And I just have to say what you said about the oak tree was so exquisitely beautiful. It was already a poem waiting to be written down. I hope you actually take what you spoke aloud and just play with that a little bit, because that was gorgeous. I want to be an oak tree that can provide sanctuary for others, if only for a little while. Like, what a beautiful prayer poem.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will definitely be taking some of these images and some of the concepts in an embodied way into working with my directees. So thank you.
So glad. Thank you all.